Afternoon, everyone. My name is Leo Lane, and I sit on the Law Society of Yukon's Continuing Professional Development Committee. I want to begin by recognizing that I am speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Kwanlindun First Nation and the Ta'an Council. The title of today's session is Health and Wellness in the Legal Profession 2022 National Study Results. And I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Brooke Greenberg, King's Counsel of Fasken's Vancouver office. Brooke, in his legal practice, conducts complex commercial construction and forestry litigation. But what brings him here are his roles as bencher of the Law Society of BC, where he chairs their mental health task force. And he is also a council member of the Federation of Law Societies of Canada, where he's a member of the National Wellness Study Steering Committee. Brooke is going to be explaining to us what the National Wellness Study is, what findings it has uncovered so far, and what lessons we can all draw from it for how to improve and safeguard the mental well-being of legal professionals. Just before I turn things over, a few comments. We've allotted an hour and a half over this lunch break for the presentation and discussion afterwards. Brooke does encourage audience participation, so if at any point when he's speaking you have a question or a comment, just type it into the chat window and he will see it pop up and respond. And if you prefer to wait till the end, we will also save time for a Q&A afterwards. This presentation is being recorded. If you have to leave early or if you want to recommend it to any of your colleagues, there will be a link to the video and Brooke's PowerPoint presentation on our website. It'll be up in the next couple of days. You just go to lawsocietyukon.com. On the main menu under the heading for the lawyer, you'll see CPD events, and on that link you can find announcements for our upcoming events and also materials and video recordings of many of our past events. So thank you all for participating today, and please join me in welcoming our speaker, Mr. Brooke Greenberg. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Leo. And I'll just start by saying I'm coming to you today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. Thanks for the intro, Leo. You really covered off a lot of the logistical things that I was going to start with. In terms of the presentation today, as Leo pretty well summarized, there are really three things that I wanted to cover off. The first is to talk about this study and its findings, and I'll go through that in some detail, including throwing lots of stats at people, because who doesn't love stats over lunchtime? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about why, outside of what the study concluded, why I think that legal professionals seem to be particularly susceptible to at least some experiences with mental health and substance use issues. And then the last thing, as Leo's summarized, talk a little bit about what we can all do to try to better address these issues from the perspective of regulators, the law societies, employers and law firms, and individual lawyers as well. So those are the three things that I plan to cover off. Again, not trying to repeat what Leo said, but I really do encourage questions, comments, discussion. So it's not just me as talking at people. Please do feel free to use the question function or the chat if it's turned on, and I'm not entirely sure, to make this as interactive as possible. So I do welcome questions. I try to keep an eye on the slides and the question box, so if I don't get to it immediately, I will definitely try to notice questions and respond to them in real time. And I will leave some time for questions and discussions at the end. So feel free to post questions as we go along, or if you're more comfortable saving them till the end. The last thing I'll say in introduction is, in discussing these issues and in discussing the findings of the national study, we'll be dealing with some sensitive topics. So I'll give you that warning ahead of time. If people are finding some of the discussion to be too much, feel free to just kind of step away from the screen for a bit. But also, I find when people first hear about the results of the study, they often conclude that it's kind of a pessimistic study, and the results are always characterized as concerning or disturbing even, and they are concerning. But I actually come at this from a place of optimism, because what the study, and I'll get to it shortly, really finds is what people's experiences are. And so having the chance to really understand the experiences of legal professionals, and to share them and to talk about them and to look to better address them, I think is an actually very hopeful thing. And so while some of the figures we'll talk about may seem concerning to you, I hope you'll join me in coming at this from a bit of a place of optimism, that at least we're talking, understanding where people are at, and trying to be supportive of those in the legal profession. So with that, let me just start sharing my screen, because I do have a slide deck for people. And I'm just going to go through the slides. I believe the slides will be made available, and I say that because as I go through them, there are links to certain the study itself and certain information that I talk about along the way. So these topics have been discussed within the legal profession for decades now, but really a more significant discussion of mental health and substance use issues was really kicked off in 2016 by a comprehensive report that came out of the US. That was then followed by a study in Quebec, and it really got a lot of law societies, legal professionals, the CBA talking about these things. And so up until now, we've been relying on a lot of data from other jurisdictions to inform what we think the experiences of legal professionals has been. But with the release of this national report, we really do now have a lot of information, a lot of data, a lot of evidence about people's experiences in the legal profession. And so we have a much better idea, a much better understanding. And I'm going to go through some of that with you today. But before I turn to the results of the report, just how did this thing come about? The report was commissioned by the Federation of Law Societies in partnership with the CBA. It was prepared by the same researchers who've done the earlier Quebec study, and they used a relatively similar approach. And that approach was to use voluntary surveys sent out to people across the country on an anonymous basis. Some of you may have even seen or filled out the survey. If you did, you'll know that it was very comprehensive. It ran to a couple hundred questions. It took most people about an hour and a half to fill out. So we were really gratified to get as many responses as we did. We had over 7,000 responses, so it gave us a really good amount of data. We had responses from every jurisdiction in the country. We had responses from all different practice areas, and the respondents weren't restricted just to current lawyers. The respondents included articled students, licensed paralegals in Ontario, and people who had been lawyers but had recently left the profession. So we really had kind of broad sampling. I've given a link at the bottom to the full report. I'll warn you, the full report runs over 400 pages and has appendices and recommendations beyond that. So if you want to look at some of the data or some of the methodologies, the report is there for people to review, but it really is quite comprehensive. And so that also means that I'm only going to be able to give you a bit of a snapshot of some of the more significant findings, I think, anyway, that are included in the report today. So one of the things that the report does, aside from being really comprehensive, and you'll see this is kind of a theme as I go through some of the responses, is it really illustrates that experiences with mental health and substance use issues are experienced really broadly among legal professionals. There's high levels as compared to the general population in pretty much every demographic group that makes up the study of legal professionals. But beyond that elevated experience, there are demographic groups, particularly those who've been previously underrepresented or discriminated against or currently discriminated against within the legal professions, that then experience these issues with mental health and substance use at even higher levels still. So it really does, the report, show that there's a compounding effect on people in terms of their experiences within the legal professions. And I'll see that when we turn to the findings of the report. And so the first findings within the report that I want to talk about are with respect to what the report called psychological distress. Now, if you want to take a look at the methodology section of the report, you can see their explanation for how they define certain mental health issues, how they tested for them, and things like that. But psychological distress is not a recognized diagnosis, not a recognized condition within the DSM. But what the researchers did was characterize psychological distress based on a collection of symptoms. So really what it was is kind of a catch-all for some of the other mental health issues that I'll talk about in a minute. And so if people were experiencing anxiety or having trouble sleeping, those kinds of things, those were some of the symptoms that were indicators for the researchers of what they called psychological distress. And so what they did was they characterized based on the responses how many people they thought gave enough responses that were consistent with their definition of psychological distress to characterize them that way. And so the researchers' conclusion was that almost 60% of legal professionals experience psychological distress, this kind of catch-all definition. Beyond that kind of overall figure, the groups that the researchers concluded experienced the highest levels of psychological distress included women legal professionals in their first 10 years of their career, legal professionals living with a disability, and those who identified as being part of the LGBTQ2S+ community. And just in terms of the demographics, because this was all based on survey results, everything that the researchers characterized in terms of demographics was based on self-identification. So people were asked if they considered themselves part of these communities or as experiencing a disability, those kinds of things. With respect to depression, that is a recognized disorder. And so what the researchers did was ask people the kinds of questions that they would in a diagnostic setting. They caveated, and of course they can't actually diagnose people through a survey process. And so what they did was they just concluded based on people's responses whether their responses were consistent with experiencing depression disorder, and they used the responses to characterize how severe roughly they thought that was. And so you can see over 28% of legal professionals experienced not just depression disorder based on their responses, but moderate to severe, so high levels of depression disorder. One of the things that was really helpful was at the same time this survey was being conducted in support of this study, there was a survey that used very similar methodology being conducted of the general public in Canada. And so what the researchers had available was a pretty consistent methodology to compare the legal professionals who responded and provided the data for their survey to the general public. And what you can see is when you compare the experience of legal professionals, it's almost, not quite, double what average Canadians experience in terms of moderate to severe depression disorder. Again, the researchers identified the groups that experienced the highest levels of depression. Again, legal professionals in their first 10 years were up there, Indigenous legal professionals, and then legal professionals working in the education sector. Continuing on, the same methodology was used to try to understand people's experience with anxiety disorder. And the researchers concluded from the responses that almost 36% of legal professionals experience anxiety disorder. That compared with 13% of the general public in Canada. So almost, but not quite 3 times the level of anxiety within the legal professions. And again, the groups experiencing the highest level of anxiety were legal professionals, this time in their first 15 years of their career, women legal professionals, and legal professionals in private practice. So I said we're going to be dealing with some difficult topics, and there's probably none more difficult to talk about than discussion of suicide and suicidal ideation. And so, you know, for those who may have had experience with suicide in their lives, the next couple of slides in the next few minutes are going to deal with discussion of suicide. And so if for you think it's best to kind of step away for a moment, now is the time to do that, and you can come back in a few moments. But the next few slides as well will be dealing with what the researchers found on this topic. And so this is one area where there was significant difference in the results of this national Canadian study and the previous 2016 US study that I referred to earlier. Here, almost a quarter of legal professionals reported having had suicidal thoughts at some point during their practice. That's significantly higher than the general population in Canada, more than double. Where around 12% of Canadians reported having suicidal thoughts at some point in their lives. It's also significantly higher than that 2016 US study of US lawyers. And we're not sure why it is that the levels are so much more elevated, especially compared to US lawyers. Part of it may have been timing. Part of it may have been as we talk about and have more research and surveys and participation, we generally see people are more willing to discuss, even in an anonymous setting, their experiences. And so it may just be that people were more willing in 2020 in Canada to talk about their experiences with suicidal ideation than the US lawyers were, or it may be there's some sort of substantive difference there that we just have to look into. But the top line number, the big consideration for us is that almost 1 in 4 legal professionals has had suicidal thoughts some point during their practice. The researchers identified and broke those stats down by where people worked. So in private practice, all of the averages were similar, but there were some differences. In private practice, a little bit under that overall average. Same for those working in-house at for-profit corporations. Those in government, public, not-for-profit sectors had higher levels of suicidal ideation than the average, and lower for those who were in legal education. The groups experiencing the highest level of suicidal ideation, significantly for this presentation, those who are practicing in the territories, within range of the average, but definitely a significant step up from the overall 24%. Almost 1 in 3 lawyers in the territories had suicidal thoughts at some point during their careers. Already talked about the practice area, and then lawyers who identified in the survey as non-binary had very high levels of suicidal ideation. The researchers made a note that part of that might be attributable to the fact that they had a relatively small sample size. But I think one thing that's important to consider is that the levels of suicidal ideation within the non-binary, within those who identify as non-binary in the general population is also extremely elevated. So we just have to be mindful of the experiences that different demographic groups have with different mental health and substance use issues. The last mental health issue that I'll cite some stats about is with respect to burnout. Now, unlike anxiety and depression and suicidal thoughts, burnout, again, isn't a recognized disorder. And so what the researchers defined burnout as was a feeling of either physical or emotional exhaustion associated with your work life. And so they asked a bunch of questions about that and assessed people's responses to come to the conclusion that almost 56% of legal professionals experienced moderate to severe burnout. If you want to see again how they characterized those things or measured them, there's a whole section on methodology in the report itself. The groups experiencing the highest levels of burnout: women legal professionals under 40, legal professionals living with a disability, legal professionals in the LGBTQ2S+ community, and then legal professionals in Nunavut. Now, the report also compared the experiences of people in certain demographic groups based on how they identified in the survey. I've noted that these percentages are unweighted because, unlike the figures that we've just gone through, in order to compare certain groups, the researchers had to use a different approach. I only note that because some of the numbers might not completely jive with the ones that we've just been through, and that's because they used an unweighted approach here, unlike in the numbers that we've just been looking at. And so I'm not going to read all of the stats to you on the slide, but what you can see is that for those who identified as being white legal professionals, there are high levels of experience with psychological distress, with depression, and with burnout. But then for those who the report said they self-identified as ethnicized legal professionals, and that's the terminology used in the report itself, there are higher levels experienced still, and then the highest levels of each of psychological distress, depression, and burnout was experienced by our Indigenous colleagues. So you can see, again, this intersectional experience that people have, that throughout the professions, regardless of demographics, there are high levels of experience with each of these things. And then as you look at groups that have been traditionally underrepresented or discriminated against, those experiences are even elevated still beyond that. That was true for those who identified as part of the LGBTQ2S+ community as well, which was almost 9% of the respondents. 75.5% of respondents in that community identified that they'd experienced psychological distress by their responses as measured by the researchers. Higher levels of depression and burnout and suicidal ideation as compared to other respondents. Similarly, legal professionals who identified that they lived with a disability, higher levels of psychological distress than those without, higher levels of depression and burnout as well. One of the larger sections of the report dealt with incivility. It actually also dealt with a number of other issues that I could probably do an entire presentation on. Can't do it within the time we have today, but dealing with things like harassment, physical violence, emotional violence, bullying. There was a lot of data within the report, and a lot of it is somewhat distressing about people's experiences with those aspects of practice. In terms of incivility, you can see Almost 12% of legal professionals reported experiencing not just incivility, but often or many times experiencing incivility. So that's a pretty high rate for people to be experiencing incivility frequently or often. The groups that reported the most instances of incivility were Ontario paralegals, professionals living with a disability, Indigenous legal professionals, and LGBTQ2S plus legal professionals. So again, you can see this intersectionality, this kind of compounding effect of people's experiences within the legal professions. And so that's pretty much what I just summarized in this slide. Those who have been traditionally underrepresented or discriminated against have these elevated levels of experience, not just with depression, burnout, suicidal ideation, but also in terms of how they feel they're interacting with others within the professions, and so resulting in higher levels of incivility. Now, I've been talking about people's experience based on some of the demographic issues. What the researchers also did was take a look at where people practiced in terms of not just the context, but also their areas of practice. Probably not surprising to many that in criminal law and family law, practitioners who had that as their primary areas of practice experienced elevated levels of each of distress, depression, and burnout as compared to other practice areas. I say that's not surprising because I hear that anecdotally whenever I talk about these issues. But then also, I think people understand that criminal law and family law in particular have a lot of vicarious trauma, have a lot of compassion fatigue. There's just a lot that practitioners in those areas deal with that some other areas of law may not deal with quite as frequently or as intensely. What the researchers identified was areas as well of practice with what they call the lowest levels of experience with distress, depression, and burnout. And if you look at those in the ADR practice area, they do have lower levels of each of distress, depression, and burnout. But if you take a closer look, although they're significantly lower, they're not that low once you take the whole picture. So still over 50% of those in the ADR area experiencing distress, a quarter depression, almost 50% burnout. So there are lower numbers, but they're not low by any means. And then if you take a look at the wills and estates and real estate practice areas as compared to civil litigation, which is listed as one of the highest levels, distress and burnout, the wills and estates experiences are actually higher than civil litigation. It's only depression that's slightly lower. So I think what you can take from this set of results from the study is that area of practice certainly has a contributing effect. There are some correlations, particularly when you look at some of the more emotionally charged practice areas. But even with the lowest levels at ADR, you're still talking about high levels of experience with all of these mental health issues. So I'm just taking a look in the question and answer box. Somebody's posted that they agree with the findings for Indigenous legal professionals. And then there's a question, what do we define as distress? And so that's the psychological distress that was the first slide that I talked about in terms of the results. So again, distress is not a recognized disorder. It is a description of a bundle of symptoms that the researchers use to be kind of a catch-all. So within the psychological distress definition, you will have people who satisfy the definition for depression, for anxiety, but what the researchers I think were trying to do was make sure they captured not just those who would qualify under clinical definitions for depression and anxiety, but also those who were experiencing similar symptoms, but for whatever reason, they wouldn't classify as being in the moderate to severe depression or anxiety definitions. No problem. I got to thank you in the Q&A. Again, I probably can't do justice to the methodology in the time frame we have. There's a whole section on methodology, and it's very researcher, full of researcher argot. So you might be able to interpret for yourself better than I, and that's part of the reason that I gave the link to the report itself. If you're really interested in the methodology wonkism, there's a whole section on that. One of the things that the report talked a lot about, especially when we come to recommendations, was billable hours. And that's understandable given some of the findings, which really did show that there is some correlation between people having billable hour targets. So just, I want to pause there to say the stats that are talked about in these slides are with respect to people's targets rather than number of actual hours performed, although there's discussion of that in the report as well. And so what the report concluded was that those who had billable hours targets of less than 1,200 hours per year, you can see experienced distress and burnout in particular at significantly lower rates than those who had targets of 1,200 to 1,800. And then there's a step up again in those experiences of distress and burnout for those who had targets of more than 1,800. The report talked about how many hours people reported having to actually work in order to get their billable hours, and identified that as a particular source of distress and burnout for people in terms of having to put in significantly more actual hours in order to achieve their billable targets. The report didn't talk a lot about size of firm or those kinds of things, but did note in passing that there's a correlation between size of firm and billable hours expectations. And so that's about as much as the report talked about in terms of size of firm, and didn't separate out, at least in terms of how they reported, sole practitioners versus those in small offices. They didn't segregate out the results that way. I often get that question. There was some correlation, but it was less clear, at least I think, between your billable hours targets and the experiences with depression and anxiety. So you can see that those who had no target or a target of less than 1,200 had lower levels of depression and burnout than those who did have a target above 1,200. But once you get to 1,200 to 1,800, there wasn't that big a difference between 1,200 to 1,800 and more than 1,800. So although in the previous slide, you can see the higher the numbers, the more psychological distress there was less correlation between depression and anxiety, although I notice now in this slide, I incorrectly have burnout there, whereas that was the burnout slide. So there's a typo I've just noticed. Sorry to everybody. That should say depression, and those figures are for anxiety. But you can see that billable hours targets and expectations certainly have a compounding effect for people's experiences with all of those things. The report itself goes on to talk a lot about the effect of billable hours, and I think that that's a reasonable point to make and something that we should have discussion about. But I also think that if the whole issue that we're dealing with was attributable to billable hours, you would see a lot more difference between the work settings that you would expect to have billable hours and those that don't or have different billable hours expectations. But what we see is across the board throughout the professions, regardless of work context, there are high levels of experience with all of these things. So I think the billable hours discussion is an important one, but it doesn't cover everything off. It doesn't cover off those who don't have billable hours targets, yet still have high levels of experience with depression, anxiety, and the other issues that we've been talking about. The report did deal with substance use issues, although it wasn't as comprehensive, I think, as how it dealt with some of the mental health issues that we've been talking about. The stats with respect to use of alcohol in the legal professions in Canada were pretty consistent with the findings of that 2016 US study. So you can see that there are high levels, more than a third of legal professionals, regardless of gender, that based on their responses, the researchers concluded had potential alcohol dependency. And one thing that some people are sometimes surprised by is that the level of potential alcohol dependency is higher among women legal professionals than men. That was the conclusion in both the national study and the previous US study. But regardless, relatively high levels of potential alcohol dependency throughout the professions. This was an interesting set of conclusions. So the survey was conducted in the summer of 2020. And so by that point, cannabis was legal in Canada. And so the cannabis use isn't included in the stats for illegal drug use. There are separate statistics about cannabis use. But in terms of true illegal drug use, the numbers are really, really low. So 14% of legal professionals reported using illegal drugs once or twice during their career, 3% monthly, 0.6% weekly, 0.2% daily. And, you know, it's very possible that those are completely accurate figures and that illegal drug use is just really low in the legal professions. What I think is more likely, and you can see from that 2016 US study that I've referred to a couple of times, what happened in the 2016 US study was lawyers, American lawyers, gave responses that allowed the researchers to make conclusions about their experience with alcohol, with mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, those kinds of things. But they didn't publish any results about lawyers' experience with illegal drug use because so few American lawyers in the 2016 survey answered those questions at all. They skipped over them like they didn't even exist. And so no conclusions were provided because they didn't have statistically meaningful answers. And so what I think you can see from both that 2016 study and the responses to this study is, even when we're talking about these highly stigmatized issues where there's a lot of shame and embarrassment and stigma built around them, there are hierarchies of stigma. And people just are not going to respond to things they think can get them in trouble, even in the context of an anonymous survey. And so I think that's probably consistent with what was going on with that 2016 US study. In any event, this is one of the slides that I take particular interest in. I hope you find it interesting as well, partly because, well, in large part because I think it gives us a lot to work on, a lot to understand about why we have these experiences within the legal professions. And so what the survey did was provide highly stigmatizing statements in the survey questions and ask people, A, whether they agreed with these highly stigmatizing statements, and then B, whether they thought other people within the legal profession thought that. And so I'm not going to read them all to you, but you can see the propositions were things like people experiencing mental health issues could just snap out of it. Or the last one, people who experience mental health issues are less capable. And so what you can see consistently, and again, I'm not going to read the stats to you, you can see them yourself, is that relatively low numbers of people agreed that they believed the stigmatizing statement. So from 9.3, 3.6, the last one, almost 20% of people believing people who experience mental health issues are less capable, is a troubling one. And that's a point I'll come back to in a few slides from now. But universally, people assumed or responded that they thought others thought those stigmatizing things at much higher levels than people actually believed. And so I think there are a few things that this allows us to work on. First of all, when we talk about these things, when we present about them, when we talk more in a bit about who experiences these issues, it helps, I hope, reduce that first number of people who actually agreed with the stigmatizing statement, because you can see it's a huge portion of the profession that experiences these issues, and it's not that a huge portion of the profession is less capable. So that initial number we can keep bringing down through awareness, through discussion, but really it's people's belief that other people think these negative things that it cloaks these issues with stigma and shame. And so the more that we understand that others don't believe these stigmatizing things any more than we do, that really helps reduce the power of the stigma, the power that shame has over all of us. It shouldn't be possible for one half of the profession to stigmatize the other half. It is because we have this self-stigma, we have this belief that other people have these negative feelings about those who experience the different issues that we've already been through. So I think understanding these results from the report and talking about them, I think is really hugely important to destigmatizing these issues. And so that really carries me into moving on from statistics, which I'm sure some people are happy to hear, although I'm going to have some statistics in a few slides from now, just understanding why it is that we seem to have these results. So, of course, we all know law is stressful and demanding. Of course it is. We all know that. We know that in law school. We know that when we start practice. But other professions are stressful as well. And they don't seem to have necessarily at least the same types of outcomes that we do. A couple of things that I think are really important to understanding why legal professionals seem susceptible come from studies that are different than and precede the national study I've just been talking about. So US studies have concluded that students begin law school healthier both physically and mentally than certainly the average population, but even as compared to other professional programs. But certainly by the end of third year of law school, and even within first year, law students are experiencing elevated levels of anxiety and depression. And so these issues that we deal with, these results that we have, they start in law school. And I think that's important to understand because that's before we've had billable hours targets or demanding clients or mean judges or all of the other things that we often attribute these results to, which are legitimate things to talk about, but it can't be the whole answer because the roots of everything start at law school. And I think part of that is because when you talk to people, they get into law for really great reasons. They want to help people. They want to see justice served. They want to serve the community. But in law school, because in most jurisdictions, you have to article in order to gain entry to the profession, pretty quickly law school directs you to getting the grades you need in order to get articles. And so people's community service, dedication to justice, all the things that motivate a lot of people to go to law school get overtaken by this demand for grades. And that gets reflected in the profession as well. And part of what is dissatisfying, I think, for people is having these values that they have that lead us into law really subsumed by other things that are kind of forced on us to be valued and more important than the things we actually really want to do or wanted to do. Another study that I think is really important to understanding, why we have these results was a Canadian study that concluded that the lawyers with the traditional hallmarks of success, and so that includes financial success, it includes accolades and having positions that are in high demand, were the most likely to experience depression in particular, but also other mental health and substance use issues. And I think that's important to understand for at least a couple of reasons. One, lawyers are anomalous that way, and lawyers are anomalous in a lot of ways. But in other professions, those who have financial and other traditional hallmarks of success, that correlates with better mental health outcomes. For lawyers, that's not the case for some reason. But it also is important because it's not just, it's a lot of lawyers who experience these issues. It's a lot of really great lawyers. And we're hearing that more and more as people like Justice Gascon or Justice Hollins in Alberta, other leading practitioners talk about their experiences. And again, that's really important for destigmatizing because we saw how many people were willing to agree with the idea that those experiencing mental health issues are less capable. And certainly the number of people who thought other people thought that. It's a lot of really great lawyers that experience these issues. And that makes sense given how many of us are dealing with these issues just overall. And so I think that dealing with those external factors is absolutely important. It's part of something we need to discuss. But I think understanding the power of self-doubt and how much perfectionism and imposter syndrome we have in the profession is really important to understanding why lawyers and legal professionals seem even more susceptible than other professions to these issues. And so, I don't have to tell this group, but I will anyway. There are things that differentiate law, in particular, the adversarial nature of our work. And that's not just for litigators. If you're a solicitor, pretty much almost any kind of legal work, there's somebody on the other side, somebody whose role it is to say why you're wrong, to undercut what your work is. And so I'm sure being a surgeon is stressful and difficult, but you don't have a doctor on the other side of the table trying to take out the stitches you've just put in. And so because we work in this adversarial environment, I think what that does is it really makes people feel unable or unwilling to talk about when they're having their own issues. How can you be the champion for your client if you have these anxiety issues? How can you solve other people's problems if you can't solve your own? And that's just a standard none of us can meet. And so I think it really has a really negative effect on all of us who work in this adversarial environment. There are social science studies that show that, again, lawyers are anomalous in that law selects for pessimistic, skeptical perfectionists. In other programs, optimism is rewarded. In law, pessimism seems to be chosen, selected for. And that makes some sense. We're supposed to be able to see the negative outcomes, the worst case scenarios, and guard our clients against them. And so being pessimistic makes some sense. Being skeptical, we have to make sure that nothing gets by us and prejudices our clients. So we have a level of skepticism. Not everybody's pessimistic and skeptical and perfectionist, but those traits are more prevalent among people who go into law. And perfectionism, it makes sense that if you, by nature, kind of set goals for yourself that are impossible to achieve, it helps you to strive to get the grades you need to get into law school, to get the grades you need to get articles, to get the things that you need done to succeed in practice. But what that whole package means is that's also how we view ourselves and our achievements through this pessimistic, skeptical, perfectionistic lens. And so it makes sense that that leads us to be more susceptible to self-doubt and imposter syndrome. than what the profession rewards. For a lot of us, what the profession mostly rewards is quantity of work, and it mostly rewards that through financial reward. We don't necessarily get the kinds of feedback, the kinds of accolades that we really desire. And so where that leaves us, along with, I've already mentioned certain practice areas having high conflict and compassion fatigue, where that leaves us is the profession's hard on us, we're hard on ourselves, and the rewards that you get aren't necessarily the kinds of things that would help us to deal with those first two aspects. And so it's not surprising to me that there's a lot of self-doubt and imposter syndrome in the profession. I'm just going to pause here for the Q&A. Okay, so the comment is posted in the Q of A. For Indigenous legal professionals, the challenges in part are linked to having to work in a colonial system that is not reflective of Indigenous values, and in fact has suppressed and been racist to Indigenous peoples. Having to uphold a colonial racism system of Canadian law that does not protect Indigenous people is very hard to do when it protects those that harm Indigenous peoples and communities. Thank you for that comment. I'm not going to presume to try to comment further on that, other than to say that comment is fully borne out by the statistics and by Indigenous legal professionals' experiences in law and with the legal systems. That's completely borne out on the evidence. So I think anecdotally that is a helpful comment, and the only thing I can say is I'm hopeful that we are making slow progress on that, although we still work within a colonial system without sufficient recognition of Indigenous legal approaches. But I'm hopeful that that's also slowly changing and that the change will accelerate. Thank you for that comment. And so one of the things that's in the report, in addition to all the evidence that I've been talking about in the stats, at the end of each section, there's a bit of a narrative where comments, because people were able to provide comments in their responses to the survey, were collected and published by the researchers. And this one really kind of stuck out for me, because I talk a lot in dealing with these issues about perfectionism and imposter syndrome. And so what this lawyer had written in, I think it was her survey, was, despite having my own firm, having grown it, having lots of opportunities ahead, I constantly feel like a failure. If I don't get the result I or the client wanted, I berate myself. If I get the result the client wanted and that I wanted, I still berate myself, because I think that I should have aimed even higher. Maybe I left money on the table or something. And so I just thought that that's such an emblematic comment of the things that I hear and see in talking to legal professionals. You know, not only is there this feeling of failure, of self-doubt, even when you have a success and get what you want, that is somehow a basis for self-doubt. And it just seems emblematic of the perfectionism and pessimism that I think a lot of us deal with. And so if people are interested, I've done a paper, although it's both pre-pandemic and pre this national study, talking about people's experiences with perfectionism, self-doubt in the legal profession. And I include in the paper discussions about what we can do, resources, things like that. So I've given the link if people are interested. But you know, just on that front, because there does seem to be an awful lot of perfectionism and imposter syndrome. I've given a link to an article from ABA publication that talks about how people can deal with perfectionism and self-doubt. And what that article talks about is trying to turn your overly negative comment from your mind into more coaching comments. And another way that I've heard somebody who is a mental health professional, because I'm not, talk about dealing with perfectionism and imposter syndrome is when your brain is being overly and unreasonably critical, to pause and just ask yourself, if you would talk expressly to another human being the way that your brain is talking to you. And so, if I'm having self-doubt, if I'm thinking, oh, I'm never going to be able to do this discovery tomorrow, I'm not prepared, I'm stupid, I can't really handle this. And is that something, if another person came into your office and said, I'm feeling bad about this discovery tomorrow, you wouldn't say, I hope that's because you're stupid and unable to do this. You would talk to them about why they're feeling that they're not prepared or what they can do. You tell them you've done lots of these before. They always turn out. Those kinds of supportive things. The article suggests that you do that for yourself, for your own thoughts as well. But I can tell you, doing that for yourself is difficult. Training your brain not to be attacking you all the time is difficult for people. And so there are resources that are available to help people who do experience extreme pessimism, self-doubt, imposter syndrome. Nobody should feel like that's just part of who they are, or that these issues are things that are just minor, that they're not really worth looking into. What we can see from the stats and the experiences are these things have a really toxic effect on people, and there are professionals who can help us on a confidential basis. And who that is varies for different people. So I've heard people had success with psychologists or occupational therapists or just counselors through their lawyer assistance program. And so there's not kind of one answer, but there's lots of different confidential professional places that people can try and shouldn't just be dismissive. That's just how I talk to myself. These really are issues that people can get support for and do better for. And so I really encourage people, if they experience these kinds of self-doubt issues, to look for professional supports, and they are available. Talk about them in the paper. I'll talk about them a little bit more in a few slides from now. The other thing that's important is just to be empathetic to each other and talk about these issues. If you know that somebody's having a rough time, then you can be the one to talk them through it and just be empathetic, understanding. And when the time comes that you need that, you can kind of turn around and seek the same thing from other people. I've come to the point where within my office, I will pop into somebody else's office and just tell them expressly, I need somebody to tell me I'm not the worst lawyer in the world right now. And they kind of smirk and say, really? And I'm like, no, I really need that. And it helps. And then we kind of talk through it. So don't be scared to just ask for what you need. But you can do what I did before I started, just expressly asking for the support that I need, which is just talk to people and kind of elicit from them more surreptitiously the answers that will help you to deal with the negative voice that many of us experience in our brains. And so what that really comes down to is most lawyers I know are really empathetic. They really do care about their clients. They really do take on their clients' challenges. And what lots of us lack, though, is self-empathy. We're not kind to ourselves the way we are to our colleagues or to our clients. And what I learned through doing mediation training is empathy is something that you can consciously develop, that you can work on. You can work on understanding and listening. And so since you can work on empathy, you actually can work on self-empathy as well. But it's harder to do. It's harder to do for a lot of us. And so that's where having help, professional help, I think is important. And so that's another reason too why I think at law school and in CPD, we should talk more and train more about empathy and self-empathy. It really is important for us in practice, but it's important for us in having an enjoyable and sustainable practice as well. So I really encourage people to advocate for more training and talking about empathy as a tool, not just as some sort of innate feature that we're all born with or not born with. You really can develop and use it both for yourself and for others. So I told you I'd have some more stats. So back to the report. The report talked about people's experiences with seeking the kinds of professional supports that I've recommended if you're having those kind of negative thoughts or dealing with any of the other kinds of issues that we've been talking about that people seek out. And one thing I was surprised by is almost 45% of people who responded to the survey said that they had sought out professional support. That's a much higher number than in other surveys, certainly than in that US survey from 2016, higher than I would have expected. So that is heartening. I'm glad to have seen that. On the flip side, almost half of lawyers who responded said that they hadn't sought support even though they thought that they could benefit from it. And I think that's where a lot of people are at. They think that maybe there's some benefit that they could have from seeking out support, but they still don't do it. Why is that? Well, there were a lot of reasons given in the survey, and I'll come to these. I'll say they're not mutually exclusive, so that's why the numbers add up to more than 100%. But this is another area where the responses in the Canadian National Report were different than that 2016 US study. So the US lawyers almost universally said the reason that they didn't seek supports, even though they knew that they might be able to benefit or thought they might be able to benefit from them, was because of stigma and shame. That was almost everybody. Those responses were certainly there from the national study. You can see too ashamed was 13%, afraid others would find out, which is stigma and shame, 9%. But then there were a whole lot of other kind of practical barriers that people talked about. So not enough time, 26%, no lacking financial resources, 23%, didn't have enough energy, or told themselves it would pass. And so I think a lot of that shows that there are understandably practical barriers to people seeking out support. And so what I would say is, for those who've had those kinds of thoughts that, oh, if I could just get through whatever it is I'm experiencing now, next week's going to be better because this trial is going to be done or this deal is going to be done. I just have to gut through it and get to the other side. I've been there. I'm sure lots of you have been there. Or not enough energy. Oh, I've been in court all day or in this, closing all day. The last thing I can do is look for supports. All of those things totally understandable. But what you can do, if any one of those is you, is once you get to the next week, once you get to the it has passed, you can still seek out the supports at that point. And finding out what's available, finding out the different strategies that a professional can give you so that when these things return, because if you experienced it once, you're probably going to experience an issue again. Having those strategies or those resources in hand for when it rears its head again will help you be better off to deal with it. So once things do pass and you do have sufficient energy, use the time then, even if you're not experiencing whatever issue right at that moment. Professionals can give you advice, even if you're not, currently dealing with an issue. So think about that if any of these are barriers to seeking support for those who think that they could use it. Other kind of responses about the resources that are available. Only about a quarter of legal professionals had used an employee assistance program, and lots of people didn't have confidence in their employee assistance program. Similarly, a lot of people reported not having confidence in their lawyer assistance program, or the equivalent. They call it different things in different jurisdictions. And the reasons people gave for not having confidence were varied. So people, again, identified that they didn't think it was worth it. They didn't think that the issues that they experienced were serious enough. But again, if what you're experiencing is really kind of toxic thoughts, that's what's giving rise to the high levels of depression, anxiety, or at least contributing to high levels of anxiety and depression that we see in the legal profession. So people should dismiss things as well. This is just the way I am, or, yes, I beat myself up, but then I go on the next day. You can get support to help deal with those issues better. Again, you see the fear and shame and stigma are barriers. Not knowing enough about LAP, well, that's just an information barrier. We should be able to better address that. Part of it can be just go to your LAP website. I know that there's an LAP in Yukon, and you can take a look at the different services that get provided. You can talk to people about what resources are there. Knowing about LAP is important, even if you think you will never use it, because think about how many colleagues must be around you experiencing these issues. So, knowing what's available makes you better able to refer people if they are experiencing things. So people should find out enough about their LAP, regardless of whether they think they need it or not. A lot of people don't believe that their LAP can help. And then this one's really concerning to me. Almost 40% of people thought that what's disclosed to an LAP would be provided to their regulator. Now, my experiences with the Law Society of British Columbia and the BC LAP, but I would be willing to bet it's the same in the Yukon. We at the Law Society get absolutely nothing from our LAP. We don't ask. We don't even want it, because we know it discourages people if they think that there's any kind of information transfer between an LAP and the Law Society. And I can assure you, at least in British Columbia, there is none. So people should not have that concern. So I've got a bunch of slides about what the Law Society of British Columbia has done. And I know you're saying, well, we're not in British Columbia. Fair enough. But one of the great things about being part of the Federation is law societies share their work. They share their ideas and initiatives. And so I'm not going to go through these in detail. I just want to highlight some of the things that we've been doing. We established our mental health task force in 2018. We've had 4 recommendation reports. All of them have been adopted unanimously, which I'm pretty proud of, because we've dealt with some difficult issues, including difficult regulatory issues. So I've given the link to our first report. That was basically looking to increase education and awareness, both within the Law Society and the professions, and increase resources as well. So that's kind of where we started. Our second recommendation report was really focused on removing stigmatizing aspects of regulation. So we changed some aspects of our code of professional conduct. We removed medical fitness questions from our admission criteria, because that was both stigmatizing and didn't really help us. It didn't provide us with any useful information. We, of course, participated in the National Lawyer Wellness Survey, which we've talked about a lot. In October of 2021, we created an alternative discipline process, and given the link to our report there. And the ADP is something I could talk about for another hour. I won't. I know people have places to go, but it's again something that I'm really proud of. It provides a diversion-like process that supports people who are experiencing mental health or substance use issues that may have contributed, not necessarily caused, but contributed to a complaint or discipline issue. And from the people who are now administering that program, they talk about it in glowing terms in respect of the effects it's having on the lawyers in those programs. So I think that that's something that I'm really optimistic about. Our Lawyer Development Task Force is looking at alternatives other than articling to kind of address that whole "it starts in law school" issue. Our last recommendation report that we've made, and we're going to make one more after having assessed the recommendations in the national study, was to create supports that are available on a 24-hour-a-day basis through expert system tools, not to replace LAP or our employee assistance program equivalent of LifeWorks, but to supplement it. And then the second thing we recommended, which actually had a lot more response from lawyers than I had expected it to, a lot more positive response, I should say, is we found that Many lawyers have difficulty responding to a law society process. They can deal with matters on behalf of their clients as counsel, but as soon as they understand that somebody's made a complaint that the law society is investigating, they freeze up. And then they wind up oftentimes being disciplined for not being responsive to the law society, which is unhelpful for everybody. And so we've created this roster of pro bono lawyers to be on the lawyer side, to help them to respond if they want help. It's not mandatory, they don't have to take it. And just having somebody be on your side seems to have really kind of struck a chord with people. And so had a lot of feedback about what a helpful program that would be. So those are some of the things that we've been doing as a regulator to try to address these issues. Obviously, there's lots of things that firms or employers can do. So I've given a link to the US task force that responded to that 2016 US report with their recommendations and what employers can do. It depends on the size of the office, obviously, but having somebody be responsible for addressing these issues, making sure there are resources, making sure there's training, all of those things is an important role to play. Checking in with each other, and that doesn't necessarily just mean within your own office, checking in with each other just more generally. I often do presentations alongside of people who come from our Lawyers Assistance Program in BC and have gone through the LAP program and are doing better as a result. And almost universally, they start their story about how they came to seek support with somebody asked how they were doing and then genuinely listened and understood in a non-judgmental way that I wasn't doing well. And I eventually felt comfortable telling them that because they asked and seemed genuinely interested and supportive. And so we can all be the person who asks that of each other in a non-judgmental, empathetic, understanding way, and be the person who helps, get others the support that they need. We can do that for each other. It's really important. What I have advocated within my firm is not just to make resources available, which we do, we have an employee assistance program, that kind of thing, but really promote them. Talk about how we want people to use them. Make it easy, make it encouraged, have leaders talk about the benefits, especially the benefits if they've actually personally used the resources, to really destigmatize the idea that seeking support is a good thing. It's not a sign of weakness. The national study has a bunch of recommendations for a bunch of different stakeholders. I've listed them. Part of the issue with the national study is the researchers aren't legal professionals themselves. And so they don't necessarily understand everything about legal practice. And a lot of their recommendations are very general. And so that's part of the work that the Mental Health Task Force at BC is doing, is taking a look at what there is in their recommendations that we could actually practically build on. But I've listed a bunch. I'm not going to read things out to everybody, but some of them are helpful and talk about the kinds of coaching and mentoring that I've referred to, in terms of being able to speak about these issues and to help others, address them. But having resources available, developing diversity policies, because we've talked about the intersectionality of experiences between mental health, substance use issues, and the traditionally underrepresented groups within the legal professions. Having CPD programs specifically for mental health and substance use issues. Obviously, we're doing that today, but having more of that. Collecting data is important, and the report, the national study recommends it, but you also have to do it in a way that's non-stigmatizing, protects confidentiality, protects privacy. So although I agree that collecting data and evidence is important to understanding these issues, you always have to deal with these kinds of things in a very sensitive manner so that you don't stigmatize where you're trying to address a problem and make it worse. Allowing people to disconnect, I mean, again, that's a recommendation, doesn't talk a lot about how to make that practical or practicable. And it's a reasonable and an understandable recommendation. But again, different people are going to want to disconnect in different ways. And we all often talk about things in terms of how people take holidays or things like that. Whether they feel like they can take holidays is a big thing. But when people do manage to get away, for some people, they want to unplug entirely. And you need to be able to figure out the ways to allow people to do that. For some people, that's more stressful to come back to all the fires burning and not knowing what was in your inbox until you open your email on the last day of holidays. I find that more stressful than being completely unplugged. So for some people, it may be that they spend the first half hour of their morning responding to emails or saying, I'm out of the office, I'll deal with this when I get back. And that's how they disconnect. So you just have to be mindful that there's no one approach that's going to be applicable for everybody. Permitting flexible work and remote work, well, I think we were all definitely thrown into that. And I think everybody's still trying to sort out where we are now in terms of balancing in-person and remote work and how we do all those things. So those are just some of the recommendations in the report. There's a whole section, people can look at them, but again, they are somewhat general. And so if people are looking to the report for kind of solutions, I think they're more talking points and ideas that people can build around, and having kind of this dialogue about where we go from here with the national study, I think is an important one. I'll just pause there to say there is going to be a phase 2 of the national study. And what the researchers are doing for that is, having done the anonymous surveys and seeking a whole bunch of comprehensive information, they're doing one-on-one interviews with about a dozen legal professionals in each and every jurisdiction, and having a more, a less data-driven, a more narrative-driven investigation. I'm not sure what the phase 2 report from that is going to look like, but they are doing a bit of a deeper dive with one-on-one interactions, although personally, I think that I would have preferred if they had a bit more than just a couple of dozen interviews, but I guess it's all a matter of resources and time. So stay tuned for phase 2 of the report, and we'll see what they come up with. And so in terms of what we can all do just as individuals, again, understanding these issues, talking about them in non-stigmatizing ways, watching our language around people, because you never know what people are experiencing in terms of how you talk about mental health or substance use issues. Advocating for more resources provided by everybody, by your employer, by Law Society, CBA. Just the more resources that are available, the more we can support each other. Again, just being mindful about how you are doing and whether your brain is doing the trick of lying to you and saying overly negative things, but also just listening to others and how they're doing. Again, checking in and being the one to say, everything going okay, and genuinely listening. That can be the support that people need to really put them on a path to getting more support. And the last point, don't put up your own barriers. So understandable if you don't have the energy or the time to address whatever issues you might be dealing with in the moment, but find the time when it's available, when you have the energy, and get some advice, some support, some resources, some strategies. And with that, I've left some time at the end, although we had some great questions and comments along the way. But if people have questions or comments, want to discuss anything, throw out ideas, whatever, we have a few minutes left to do any of those things.
Thank you, Brooke. I wanted to start by just picking up on one of the points you made earlier about the Lawyers Assistance Program. So the Yukon Law Society does fund a confidential referral and counseling service provided through NIMCO and Associates. There's 24-hour phone access. It's fully confidential. All we get is billing information, which even that is anonymized. So, the concerns that the study found with people using the service just don't arise the way that it's been structured. So I do encourage people to take advantage of that service.
It's great that it's 24-hour availability too, because what I always talk about is that 3 a.m. wake up where you have doubts about something, panic about something. That's oftentimes when people need some support, but you don't necessarily think about using a number at 3 in the morning, but it's there, it's available, and that's a really good thing. So the other thing I think that people sometimes have a barrier about, especially if it's a phone-in number, is, oh, who's on the other side of the line? What should I expect? And the things that I've heard from people's experiences with LAPs across the country is, it seems terrifying at the time to pick up the number, but it's a really non-intrusive, easy intake system. It's somebody who's just there to help, and it is totally confidential. So people should have that. I understand the anxiety about phoning a number and not knowing what's going to happen, but I think people should not should be confident that they can do that.
I had a couple of questions just while we're waiting here. So I was surprised by the higher levels of anxiety, or maybe not surprised, but I think it was noteworthy, the higher levels of anxiety and depression emerging right from law school, given what the study found about how students entered the state that they entered law school in versus leaving, and also surprised by the stats that showed higher levels of depression in professionals working in legal education. That was not intuitive, or at least I didn't have those assumptions. So I was wondering if the study, I guess a two-part question, did the study examine the way that we educate lawyers for possible keys to understanding the stats that come out of the profession? And also, following the study, has the Federation reached out to or been approached by law schools in Canada to see what can be done to address some of these issues before they become really entrenched?
Yeah, I mean, the study talked a little bit about law school, but the study that identified that the roots really do start at law school was a US study and wasn't part of the national study. So it didn't emphasize the law school piece as much. In terms of the second part of your question, law schools, I think, are doing a better job about making resources available. I'm not sure that they have really kind of grasped what the underlying contributors to the need for those resources are. And so they haven't come to the Federation so much as what we're trying to do at the Federation now, after this study, is look at everything through a few different lenses. We try to look at everything through a truth and reconciliation lens, and look at everything through a mental health and substance use issue lens. And so all of our different committees are getting some kind of idea about these really underlying fundamental issues and trying to ask questions and create resources and standards with those fundamental issues in mind. So I think we're trying to take a more holistic approach to things, and so that is infusing our interactions, including with law schools.
Thank you. Well, we're close to wrapping up here. So unless somebody wants to fire off a last minute question, I just wanted to comment that I think the first step in addressing some of these issues is understanding the scope of the issue first, and also one of the best ways to eliminate the stigma is to come together in forums like this and talk about the issues. So I think presentations like yours are essential to making the legal practice safer and more sustainable. So I do want to thank you, Brooke, for volunteering your time with us and for all the work that you've done with the Federation and with the Law Society of BC in this area. So thank you, Rassichel.
No thanks necessary. It's work that has to be done, and I'm happy to do it.
All right. It looks like we have a question submitted here from Darcy. Two thoughts. Number one, on the second national survey, have you considered that lawyers being interviewed in person may be less open or candid than they would be through an online survey? There's a significant amount of anonymity, actual or perceived, when answering sensitive questions online. And two, for me, any anonymous information about how much the IMCO services are accessed by Yukon lawyers. Brooke, why don't you handle the first part?
Yeah, I think the researchers are quite mindful of that, but it's funny is the wrong word. It's interesting that people were falling all over each other to volunteer to be interviewed, at least in some jurisdictions. In British Columbia, I know that we had a massive response to people who wanted to talk about these issues, which may skew the survey, but who really wanted to be interviewed far more than could be. And so it was an exercise of paring down the number of lawyers who were involved in the interviews. I think the fact that nothing's going to be attributable means that people still will be anonymous, if not within the survey, within the study, if not to the interviewers themselves. But we actually had a really great response in terms of people wanting to talk about these issues. I'll leave the question about usage to you, Leo.
All right, thank you. And so just to confirm, the question is about the Yukon Lawyers Assistance Program. And it may have been my mispronunciation, but it's Nimco and Associates is the service that we use. And Darcy, in answer to your question and for the benefit of anyone else who's interested, I don't have the numbers at hand, but in our annual report, the Law Society's annual report, there were some figures about how often the service is used by Yukon Law Society members. So please check that out if you have an interest.